On episode 116 of the Vincast, I chat with Brian Walsh, former chief winemaker of Yalumba Vintners in South Australia and now chairman of Wine Australia. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gasbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I guess it's more like a welcome back to the show after quite a period of time that I haven't been releasing any episodes. Unfortunately, I've been very, very busy with work and also, making some wine again this year. But probably most importantly, the arrival of my son Oliver, who I am really, really happy that, of course, he's in my life and, of course, is the most important thing to me. And so, unfortunately, I had to have different priorities, but I'm super excited to be able to release some new episodes and hopefully I'll be able to fit in some more recordings very soon to share some more great wine stories from people behind the wines that you enjoy. But I think probably one of the most exciting guests that I've ever had on the show I was able to record with when he was recently in Melbourne during the Top 50 Restaurants of the World award ceremony. It was held in Melbourne. The first time it was in Australia. I think on the second time it was outside of London, and there were some of the world's best sommeliers here as well. And Wine Australia were they put together a fantastic program for them to teach them about the history, some of the iconic Australian wines, but also the dynamic nature and the changing face of Australian wine. And Brian Walsh, the chairman of Wine Australia, was in town and was very generous to share some time with me to actually talk about his background and what his input in philosophy is as far as Wine Australia. So I really do hope you enjoy my chat with Brian. He's an incredible person. He won the Len Evans Award for contributions to the Australian wine industry in 2016. And so I really did learn a lot from his story. So stick around until the end so you can find out how to get in touch with both of us to share your impressions of the show. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. So I'm very honoured to be joined today by Brian Walsh, the chairman of Wine Australia, and I'm really thrilled that he was able to find some time during a pretty hectic week here in Melbourne with some of the top sommeliers of the world during Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. So thank you very much, Brian, for making some time.
My pleasure, James. Great to be here.
Brian, I always ask my guest at the start of every episode if they can remember the first interaction that they had with wine that kind of made them think about it in a different way and thought that maybe that's something that they'd want to do longer term, as a career.
Mine was a little bit organic in as much as I started work as a laboratory assistant in a winery that was Chateau Reynalla it was where Hardy's headquarters now is.
Yeah.
And without necessarily at the time thinking this was going to be a career, it was almost a temporary job while the incumbent went away to Roseworthy to do the enology course. And so my job was doing sulfur tests and alcohols and all those things and generally acting as a dog's body for the production manager. Yeah. But one of my jobs was setting up the trials, the trial blends and all the tastings for the winemaker and the then managing director who was also a winemaker. And so I'd set these up and then I'd be in the adjacent room behind, through a sliding door, and I'd listen to them discussing the wines.
Sounds a bit like a wine show, like you're the steward.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, it was a bit like a steward. Yeah.
And then you pour the wines and you'd go and you'd sort of listen into.
Yeah. So that I wasn't included in the conversation, other than I was eavesdropping.
Right.
But then after they'd left, then I'd go in to clean up, and then I'd go through and see if I could pick up what they were talking about and understand the wines themselves. So it was almost a self-taught thing. And then after about several months, I suppose, I thought I really enjoyed this. I really like the whole thing about putting wines together and seeing if 1 and 1 can equal 3 and and the tasting and understanding what's going on.
So more from a sort of a scientific, technical side?
No, it wasn't really that scientific. I didn't have a tertiary degree or anything. It was just more the flavour and the texture and understanding, what they were trying to achieve. And so after about 6 months, I then said to the company, well, maybe I wouldn't mind going off to Roseworthy as well and doing a winemaking course, and would they consider supporting me? And at the time, it didn't suit them to do that. And so
that's a very politically correct way of saying it. It's a very, very diplomatic way of saying it.
well, I guess it was. I mean, they had no obligation to do that. But they'd already done it with somebody else, and that didn't work out satisfactory, because in the end he didn't come back to work. So I thought, they probably thought
they're a bit gun shy.
Once bitten, twice shy.
Yeah.
So at I think the ripe old age of 20 or 19, I thought, I might move on then. So I left for a while and did some labouring work down in the almond orchards of Willunga, near where I lived, and then eventually just went back to visit some of my mates in the cellar there, and my former boss said, "Can you help us out a little bit for vintage?"
Yeah.
And as they say, the rest is history. I didn't leave the wine industry after that, and that was so it'll be 50 years next year that I've been actually in wine.
Wow, fantastic. Did you grow up in that area?
I grew up in a little town called Aldinga, which is just on the coastal side of Willunga, and Willunga's on the southern side of McLaren Vale Township. So it's all in that McLaren Vale region. So
Right.
I played footy against McLaren Vale and Willunga, or I played for Willunga, in fact. But my folks had a pub. We had a little country pub.
Okay.
These days it's fairly well developed with housing and nearby beaches.
A bit too well developed, if you asked some wine producers.
True. But I think they're trying to contain most of the development to what they call the coastal side of the South Road, to leave some agricultural reserve for vines. Although when I was young, there were more almonds and vines, but eventually the almond growing went further up into the riverland regions,
Right.
where
Okay.
there was more water available. Essentially,
Yeah.
yeah.
So at that time, with the pub, was there a reasonably thriving wine industry, and were people like drinking wine, or was it still fairly
Well,
agricultural in style?
Wine, as we know it today, wasn't a big part of the local beverage diet. In fact, from a young age, I think I was probably 11 or 12, I used to sort of man the little bottle department that we had at the pub, which only really opened on holiday weekends and those sort of things, that we didn't have enough business to actually run a bottle department. But during the holiday period, because we're near a beach, lovely beaches, Port Willunga and Aldinga Beach, very popular places in the summer and Easter and so on. And all our shelves were stacked with sherries, cream sherries, sweet sherries, dry sherries, wine cocktails, ports, and all those sort of things. And if somebody asked for a bottle of red or white, that was out the back, and I had to go and find a couple. There was a choice of 3 or 4 different red wines that people would want to buy.
Right.
So it wasn't part of the staple. We would find it. In fact, there were no restaurants in the McLaren Vale region. The nearest thing would be, a caravan selling steak sandwiches outside some of the pubs. That was if you wanted to eat out.
So the pubs wouldn't necessarily have
No,
kitchens
pubs
either.
didn't generally do meals. They might. I mean, mum and dad used to do them by arrangements, and of course, if you had guests staying in the hotel, you'd put on a meal for them. But
Right.
there was no real restaurant culture at all.
Yeah.
So in the wine, when we got involved in the wine industry, we used to do our own things. All the winemakers would get together and, either informally or formally through some group like the Bacchus Club or something, or the old beefsteak and burgundies, those sort of things. People would get together and go to somebody's home or on the weekend and arrange some really good food and wine, because there was nowhere else to go out. You made it up yourself. So things have changed dramatically in that time span.
Do you remember what it was that kind of made you think about just temporarily going to work for Chateau Reynalla and working in a lab of all places?
Look,
Did
it
you
was
hear
it
about the
was
job, or
no.
was it
Look, it was
advertised?
pure. Well, yes, it was advertised. Wasn't particularly interested in rushing off to work. To be honest, I was, left school and was mucking around and doing a bit of surfing and bits and pieces,
Oh
and
yeah.
my mother would actually, find little jobs in the local paper and put rings around them and leave them on the kitchen table for me to consider. And so I was,
My dad did that for a while.
so actually went for one job, working for a hotel broker, and who knows where that might have led. I guess that was because mum and dad were in a hotel, and then this was the second job that I went along for, and it was just a job essentially. It wasn't meant to be a stepping stone to a career. That all just happened down the track. So, in fact, I was planning to go to university and do physiotherapy,
Really?
and so I deferred. I got accepted, and then I deferred for a while to have a year off. I was relatively young when I matriculated, and so it was just the way. So anything could have happened. I could have been a hotel broker or a physiotherapist, but I finished up in wine.
Right.
And it's been fantastic, of course, for me.
And for many more as well. Back in those days, what was sort of the wine production like? Was it fairly heavily, geared towards fortified wines, or was there a lot of still wine,
Yeah.
dry wine production?
Yeah, well, I was very lucky. Chateau Reynalla was run by a bloke called Colin Hazelgrove, who is a fairly famous wine name of that era. His brother ran Mildara and he ran Reynalla. And he also chaired the Australian Wine Research Institute and various things, smart cookie. And they were really very heavily involved in that early stages in the 60s of crafting some really very smart red wines, Cabernet based or Cabernet Shiraz or Shiraz based. So in those days we were still making clarets and Burgundies and hocks and so on. So essentially the clarets were Cabernet Shiraz and the Burgundies were Shiraz, and that's tend to be the way it worked out. But they were made, I think, quite intelligently. The wines were pretty smart and had French oak barrels for maturation and so on. And that was sort of the evolving part of the business. Their core business was still making flagon wines, the 2.25 litre, I think they were, or half-gallon flagons. And also sherries. So a lot of my work was working on floor sherry production. Dry sherry was a big business, and we had a couple of very popular brands of our own. Plus, also we made sherries in bulk, which we sold to people like Lindemans and McWilliams on the East Coast, and traded that as well, and under a long-term contract. So sherry production was pretty big.
And so this is before the fairly big expansion of the Australian wine industry and mergers and acquisitions. So what was the I guess the industry like as far as community and cooperation? Did you sort of work fairly closely with people when you came back, and it ended up being a long-term prospect?
That took a while to evolve for me, and probably when I was at Reynalla in those early days, I guess I was just head down, did my job, and I was quite a bit younger than all of the rest of the people in the business. My bosses were a good generation or more older than I, so that wasn't that heavily involved. Certainly, they eventually was encouraged to get involved in the wine show system, but as an associate judge in Adelaide, and went on to judge there for a number of years, and that sort of first gave me the intro to the camaraderie aspect of it. And then fairly early on, the group of the younger groups, sort of the sub-25s that I would have been in that stage, we all started to get together and created our own little group of friends who would regularly get together to try all sorts of wines over dinners and so on. So there was a really good local coterie of McLaren Vale guys, and then we tried to spread out to the Barossa and other parts and do similar social engagements. And then over time, I guess in that space, once you get involved in that, you start getting involved in the local associations, the Winemakers Association, and if there's events being organised. McLaren Vale in those days started the Bushing Festival, which is still going these days, and so generally we'd all take on the task of either running an event and whatever, and form a little subcommittee, and finished up. All of us were pretty much all in the same subcommittees, and we probably finished up buying half the tickets to go to these things anyway. But it was a good, very good community involvement and interaction amongst everybody, and I think it helps everyone grow in confidence, and you learn from your peers all the time. So it was fun.
At that time, was getting into the wine industry, as a winemaker, was that considered, a good career choice? I know that, like, when sort of the 80s and 90s and Australian wine became, a big player, particularly in the export markets, and the demand for Australian wine increased, so that there were a lot more jobs in the industry, and and they wanted qualifications and stuff like that. But before then, did many young people sort of think about getting into the wine industry?
I don't think it was high on the radar. A lot of colleagues and friends that I made through wine around that time, a lot of them came through, not necessarily through Roseworthy Agricultural College in the first instance, but they had done agricultural science at university.
Yeah.
And then towards the end of that ag science thing, which was a broad-based science degree with an agricultural focus, they started gravitating towards wine. So I think people like Brian Crozer, Bill Hardy, Jeff Weaver, a lot of these guys, that was their avenue. So I think their move into wine came a little bit later in their educational path, rather than them setting off to uni thinking, I'm going to go and graduate with a winemaking degree. So the wine industry, was almost a cottage industry in some respects. And I can remember in my early days at Reynalla, when there was the first big expansion in the Hunter Valley, a company like Hungerford Hill developed, 400 or 500 acres of vines around the Pacolban area. And we saw these ads in the industry mags for a job for a winemaker up there, and they were offering $10,000 and a house and a car, for a package, and everyone thinking, wow. That's amazing, because I know my boss at the time was on $6,000 and I was on $25 a week.
Yeah.
But the point being that suddenly there was an expansion, and that opened up a whole lot of new horizons and a whole lot of energy in that space. And then I think there was an increase in enrolments at Roseworthy for people to think, oh, there is a career here. It's not just a cottage industry. There's you can actually carve out a future for yourself.
When did you get your first sort of head winemaker position?
Well, the first title that was when I went to Yalumba in '88 as chief winemaker, and that was when I moved out of McLaren Vale into the Barossa.
Was that a big step, considering you're from pretty much from McLaren Vale?
Yeah, it was a big step. It was. It was. There were two steps. One was the actual moving out of your comfort zone into another place, but also it was quite a daunting role, I thought, and I wondered at the time whether I had the capacity to do it. But Robert Hill Smith in particular, who was the CEO at the time, persuaded me to have a go. He thought I'd really like you to come on board. So I thought, well, with that sort of backing and confidence, I would give it a go. But I had this sort of bit of lack of confidence due to the fact that I admired Yalumba from afar and admired all their work in innovation and research and development and so on. And I felt, well, here's a guy who just came up through the lab, and I was going to have to run this show, and would I have the capability of doing it properly? But anyway, as I've said to others in the past, that there's a lot of great people there, and my job was to try to harness them rather than tell them what to do, but just to give them the space to to expand their skills to the max.
Yeah. I mean, Yalumba, of course, you make an amazing range of wines. Not obviously not just the Barossa, but they have some Coonawarra stuff as well. But one of the things that I really admired them for, particularly, was the Nursery and the work in vine.
Vine breeding and propagation and importation.
So was it just chief wine? Were you just responsible for the wine making, or did you sort of have oversight across a lot of other stuff?
Look, I started off as chief winemaker, and my boss at the time, Peter Wall, was the production director. After Peter retired, I assumed that role, so in charge of all of the production from viticulture, winemaking, through to bottling, packaging, distribution, and so on. We called it director of wine. It sounds a bit nicer than director of production in the wine space. So yes, I was heavily involved in the nursery expansion, supporting our viti crew through that. And it's a very interesting thing, it's such a long-term cycle, high risk. You import a couple of cuttings, and after you get them through quarantine, you have to bulk them up and get them to a stage where you can plant out a trial vineyard and whatever, and then they could turn out to be duds, but it takes you 10 years to find out. And I know when we were signing the 20-year agreement with Ontav Inra to be their agent in South Australia and other parts of Australia, I kept thinking, are we comfortable signing a 20-year agreement? And they said, well, for the first 10 years, you won't have anything to see. So, effectively, it's a 10-year agreement. But just shows the whole nature of that thing. And then, of course, when the wine sales dropped off a little bit domestically, or there was, we'd got to the stage where there were enough vineyards planted in Australia, excuse me, and the nursery business in terms of selling vines fell away. It was again a big leap of faith from the company to keep investing in that space for the next time that people need to start replanting or looking for improved planting material or better clones or whatever. So you just keep on spending money in the hope that one day there'll be an appropriate return. Because at one stage, a lot of those activities were conducted by sort of semi-government organisations, the agriculture departments, but eventually they moved out of all that. So it's left up to private enterprise to make it happen.
Yeah.
But it's also a private enterprise that has a long-term vision of doing something of value for the whole grape and wine community.
Yeah, and obviously they stand to gain from their hard work, whereas a semi-government organisation, they sort of go, well, we have to do it. What's the incentive for us to keep doing this? At that point, that was sort of when Australian wine, in the 90s in particular, Australian wine overseas started to really boom. And, Yalumba became a pretty important player as far as an industry leader. And I guess at that time, you would have had a lot of people that were working underneath you who have kind of gone on to, whether they're still within the Yalumba organisation or they've gone up to do other things. Who are some of the people that you sort of identified and mentored that have kind of gone on to, and they've really impressed you?
Well, mentoring's an interesting thing. I think you get mentored two ways. I mean, and some of the people that I worked with, or that you could say worked under me, had great experience as well, and I learned a lot from them. People like Alan Hoey and Jeff Linton, who are both since retired from Yalumba, but they were there a long time before I arrived and are still there. I recruited Louisa Rose as an assistant winemaker I remember at the time saying, the job there as an assistant winemaker, but we don't see you've got much chance of a career growth in the next 5 years because no one's going anywhere. And within a couple of years, things had happened. People had moved around, and suddenly she was in some key roles and went on to now be the chief winemaker or head of winemaking, and has certainly made her mark and continues to make her mark. In a similar vein, there's a whole younger crew there now who are working through working through the system that I wasn't as closely involved with in the early stages, but people like Phil Lehman, I still keep in contact with. He came on board there and virtually out of university. Well, Phil did engineering first as his first degree, and then I think did a postgrad in winemaking. And he came on at the same time as Freya Honan, who was daughter of David, and then she left and eventually went back into Margaret River. But so many people to think about, and some of them are off the radar. There's a bloke called Andrew Murphy, who's virtually the production manager or head of director of production at Yalumba now. He was working as a winemaker when I went there, and is still there, and virtually took over half of my role when I left. And these are people who just work behind the scenes. They're not household names in wine, but they do all that sort of grunt work that you need to do to make organisations work.
Well, some of them become household names if they get their name on the signature.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's true. And I think Murph has got his name on the signature, the last one. Yeah, so yeah, that is a big help. It's good that those things that people are recognised in that way for their long-term contribution. Yeah.
Was it a different sort of community in the Barossa, with a slightly different kind of history, or did you find there were a lot of similarities between the community of McLaren Vale?
Look, on one level, it's similar, but the Barossa is, because of its heritage, there is a slightly different dynamic, and it's more in sort of culture and language and possibly even food and so on. But as communities, I think they are both equally positive. There is something about the wine sector that brings people together in a special way. I think it's the love of the offer, the love of wine, and the ongoing desire to actually improve wine. So everyone is very supportive of each other and not terribly secretive about issues. We're always wanting to expand knowledge and make better wine. To some extent, the job was fairly all-encompassing for me at Yalumba, and so even though I was involved in some of the local initiatives in the winemaking committees, I tended, apart from my kids going to school and getting involved in weekend sport, I tended to be pretty much, very heavily married to the job for a long part of my 25-year tenure there.
Yeah. At what point did you start to get a little bit more involved with organisations like, I guess what Wine Australia became, but it was Wine Australia, correct me if I'm wrong, was Winemakers Federation and Grape Growers?
Not quite.
No?
What's now the new Wine Australia is an amalgamation of what was Wine Australia,
right? Okay.
and a group called the GWRDC, which is the Grape and Wine Research Development Corp.
Yep.
So there were two different statutory organisations, both levy funded, and obviously the RDC is basically a research organisation,
Yep.
and Wine Australia was responsible for market development, export control, and compliance, and so those two have now been amalgamated into one. Look, I've always been involved over the years in local organisations like winemakers. I was actually on the McLaren Vale Winemakers Committee, then the Barossa Winemakers Committee. Worked with the South Australian Wine Industry Association for a number of years, and those sort of things were always encouraged by our employer, by Yalumba, to get involved in industry matters.
What were those associations responsible for? What were they set up to achieve?
The local ones or the national?
Yeah, starting from the local ones and then up to the
well, locals are mainly about local promotion and also often have a slight technical bent. So looking at improvement, things like run the local wine shows and promotional events and festivals and all those sort of things. So have a fairly local bias and strongly in promotion. Although there are always issues like local council regulations or all sorts of things that that could impact on businesses' capacity to trade. So they were all important issues. At the state level, because we have 3 tiers of government in the country, you almost need 3 tiers of industry representation. So at the
Sure.
state level, you've got licensing issues like health and safety, all those things which need to be addressed, EPA and so on. So you need a strong state association that can actually act in the interest of their members. But they're advocacy groups, so people join them voluntarily. And then the Winemakers Federation is the national one. I've never been directly involved with Winemakers Federation, but they really have to talk to the federal government about things like tax and health and market access and those sort of areas. The Wine Australia thing is a little bit different in as much as it's compulsorily levy funded, so every grower and every winemaker in the country contributes towards that. So it's not an advocacy group. We can't advocate. We can only provide service to our levy payers. So and we set out to do that to the best of our ability.
So how did you when did you start to get more involved with Wine Australia? And
well, before I left Yalumba, I got onto the board of the old Wine Australia and had a couple of years there. And it often takes a little bit of time to get your feet in that space. And then when this move came to form this new amalgamated organisation between the Research Development Corp and Wine Australia, somehow osmotically my name sort of came into the ring as someone to chair it. And I can't exactly say how that happened, but obviously there were people talking among themselves, and my name was thrown into the ring. And that role is not one that you apply for, but it actually is an appointed role by the minister. At the time was Barnaby Joyce, the Minister of Agriculture, makes that appointment. So it's funny, I didn't have an interview as such, and just get a phone call saying, do you want to chair this thing, and it starts next week. And so I took it on as something that in my own mind, the way I rationalised it through James was that I think with a new organisation, they were looking for somebody that didn't particularly have any strong positive or negative bias to one sector or t'other. Hopefully, I don't have any particular barrows to push, and I've worked with grape growers and winemakers from all spectrums, from the Riverland through to the highest cool climate regions in the world, and they're just looking for somebody that was hopefully going to be able to lead that organisation in a way which only ever had the best interests of our levy payers in mind.
Was this post Yalumba?
Yes, it was. So it's only a couple of years ago. I left Yalumba. It's gone very quickly. I left Yalumba at the end of 2012, December 12. And I think this happened, I came on in a temporary role from about the middle of 2013. So it's coming up three-ish years, or 3 or 4 years, yeah.
And you left Yalumba and set up a sort of a consultancy business?
Oh, look, I left Yalumba without a plan, deliberately. I didn't, I'm not very good at moonlighting. And so essentially I was ready after working for about 45 years, as an employee for a number of organisations, but the last 25 with Yalumba. I was just at that stage where I felt that I just wanted to try something different. I wanted to be self-employed and perhaps not have that daily responsibility for all the people that I felt I was responsible for their livelihoods as well as my own. And so I left and decided to have a few months off. And I think within early January, my wife and I went off to New Zealand Pinot conference in Wellington, which is a good way to unwind, tasting some lovely Pinots with a lot of interesting people. And then essentially it was just waiting to see what might evolve, and whether I would start doing something in my own in terms of a brand development or what have you. And I still haven't discounted that. I just haven't got there yet because Wine Australia popped up and a few other things popped up. And whilst I didn't set myself up as a consultant as such, I was invited to join a couple of wine company boards.
Right, okay.
Smaller family businesses.
Yeah.
And so those along with my Wine Australia, and I've also working with Riverland Wine in their organisation.
Okay.
So I finished up with 4 or 5, reasonably worthwhile roles and jobs, and then I do some other ad hoc tasting and consulting work for some other people from time to time. So I've got a nice varied jobs, which is one of the things I was looking for a change, looking to do something a little bit different. So every day tends to be a little bit different, and it's been fun.
Making any wine for yourself?
No.
No. Too many other things.
As I said, I might one of these days. I might, but I'm actually enjoying working with others who are making wine and doing it well. But I have a son-in-law who does some wine distribution in Adelaide, and we occasionally kick around the fact that we might do something together. But it may happen. Yeah.
So with the Amalgamated Wine Australia, this kind of newish organisation, and you being brought in to chair it, what was kind of the sort of the main priorities at the time? Obviously, this is a few years ago, so this is post financial crisis, and Australian wine in the export markets in particular was sort of needed a little bit of sort of freshening up. What were your kind of first priorities?
Well, there were a couple of obligations. Some of the very practical stuff is initially bringing two organisations together and making sure the culture is good, and that that people are harmonised in their thinking. And luckily, we had some really good people in the organisation who were committed to making that happen. And from day one, we felt it was a very seamless integration of two organisations. And we just kept reminding people that they are there for our levy payers and that need a service mentality. And even though two organisations became one on whatever it was, the 1st of July, people still needed export licenses. They still needed, a help desk and all those sort of things. So that's a very important part of our role. We then we're obliged, and we needed to anyway, to establish our 5-year strategic plan. We have to submit that to the government for approval. And so there's a lot of consultation through that phase with our stakeholders. Eventually, how we came to actually come up with what we think is both a simple and a timeless strategy was predicated on the fact that we felt very comfortable, but not complacent, that Australia's wine was in a pretty good space. We think the quality and diversity of our wines across the board is such that it can stand up to international peer comparison confidently.
Yeah.
Even though we know, as I said, there's no complacency. We have to, it's a very competitive world out there. So we felt our wine offering was good, but that globally, not so much in Australia, but globally, our reputation was more of a good value supplier rather than a high quality, or the more everyday rather than special occasion wine offering. So what we identified that as saying there is a bit of a perception about Australian wine which is slightly out of kilter, or more than slightly, significantly out of kilter with what the reality might be. And so we said, well, okay, let's just set about the task over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years of keeping pushing the boundaries and making sure that the world is seeing our best wines and understands them more clearly. And over time, hopefully gives them the opportunity to be presented as special occasion wines as well, rather than just good everyday wines. We know both sectors are important. So we really just pushed, our thinking is continue to push the concept of putting our best foot forward as often as possible, so that not necessarily in my lifetime, but hopefully in yours and your young son Oliver's lifetime, that people will look to Australia as one of the great winemaking nations of the world, rather than just another okay winemaking nation.
Yeah, look, it's really something that I found quite surprising when I was traveling in Europe, and I would meet young winemakers, who'd studied or whatever, and they wanted to go and work vintage overseas, and I suggested Australia, and I said, New Zealand sounds exciting, wow, and I think, through the combination of the fact that New Zealand is for the most part, a cool climate wine producing country. But I think also the way that they've promoted New Zealand and New Zealand wine. If you sort of compare those two, I know that Australia obviously produces vastly more wine than New Zealand does, but do you think that there are some lessons to be learnt from the New Zealand example, and now the perception that New Zealand wine is more premium and people are willing to pay more for, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc or Central Otago Pinot Noir?
Look, excuse me. There are always lessons to be learnt from all nations. New Zealand has a terrific offering, and it's a relatively simple proposition. And I guess simplicity when it comes to marketing is an advantage. Because we have such a broad array of offering that it's far more complex to try to explain the Australian proposition.
Sure.
And so which is why we need to talk about our regions rather than the country as a whole. We don't purport to the view of brand Australia. We think that's too generic.
Well, this is something that when I was doing my studies at Adelaide Uni, they were talking about the disconnect between how Australia, particularly in terms of tourism, is promoted. Beaches and outback, all sort of warm, sunny kind of things. I think it's pretty easy for people to be confused and to not know that Australia has cool climate wine regions, for example. But even the warmer producing regions aren't sort of hot like Uluru is or something like that.
Well, I think we've got 30 of our 65 wine regions are cooler than Bordeaux. So we'd actually, we've got plenty of cool regions.
People overseas are surprised we actually ski in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. So it's that's a challenge, and we continue to think about over time whether we need to have some overarching strategy in that space. But the approach we take is not we're not pushing Wine Australia, we're not pushing Brand Australia. We're actually supporting our brand owners. The brands will make the reputation, and the country reputation will follow. We're supporting our regions and supporting our people and our personalities and our places. So, I think the new thing is one of the reasons in Melbourne at the moment with the whole Best 50 Restaurants event and bringing the SOMs out, is that Tourism Australia have identified that when the people's perception about Australia changed once they've been here and seen our wine and food culture. And that's become a very, very big selling point. They've invested a lot of money in that. And so our challenge is to sort of continue to, and which is why we're engaging with these SOMs from around the world, to get them thinking about the fact that, why shouldn't they have some really fine Australian examples on their lists in their restaurants wherever they are in the globe, not as a token, but because they stand up to scrutiny as some of the great wines of the world. So I think the fact that the world's best 50 restaurants have come to Australia, first time out of the Northern Hemisphere, only the second time out of London, that they're not just here for a free trip. They want to actually come down. The people in the know there's some really wonderful things happening here in that whole food and wine space.
I think that it shows sort of the dynamic nature of the Australian wine industry in general, and a lot of the hard work that a lot of producers and people involved in the wine industry have, as far as traveling overseas, going over to the UK, going up to the US, and promoting the diversity and the, I guess, the evolution of Australian wine, whilst still, championing the classic Australian wines as well. I think that's sort of has helped a lot, probably bringing people out here, and then they get to see it sort of right in front of them. It's probably an exciting opportunity for them.
Yeah, and it is a double-edged sword. I mean, there is so much strength and interest in our diversity, but then that goes against the simple message.
Yeah.
But look, I think we can navigate our way through that, and occasionally we'll need to sort of come back and just reinforce our global leadership in Shiraz, for example, because it is something that we own and we shouldn't let that go. But in the meantime, there's so many other things that we do and do so well, and we should be able to find niche opportunities for those globally, I think.
Yeah, and hopefully they get to eat in some lovely places whilst they're here and see the Australian wines in the context of locally prepared food. But look, it sounds pretty exciting, and I think just this week is going to make a big difference in the perception of Australian wine, certainly around the world. Obviously I really appreciate you making some time during such a busy period. But thank you very much, Brian. If people would like to find out more about what Wine Australia does, there's websites and there's social media accounts, so that you'd recommend.
Go online and check out Wine Australia.
Fantastic, and there's information about events as well,
programs, activities, blogs, all sorts of information. And we've just recently upgraded our website, but as you'd probably know better than any of us, those things they're a continuum.
Yes.
But we're always looking for content, and but there's a lot of interesting stories in there about the whole wonderful world of Australian wine.
So if you get a bit tired of listening to my podcast, there's plenty more wonderful stories you can find on the Wine Australia website, and hopefully that'll lead you on other paths as well. But thanks again, Brian, and I'm wishing you the best of luck.
Thanks, James. Been great chatting to you. Cheers.
And thank you very much, guys, for listening to this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino, and I really would encourage everyone to show their appreciation to Brian for very generously donating his time and his amazing story on the podcast. So seek him out via the Wine Australia website or any of their social media channels. Of course, I'd love for you to follow me on social media. @IntrepidWino is my Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook handle. And you can also follow the podcast on Twitter @TheVincast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, which has many different editions of Let's Taste, which is where I open up one or more bottles of Australian wine and share my impressions. And it also has some videos about some of the experiences I've had in the last couple of years. Of course, all that information is available at intrepidwino.com, where you can also read about some of my previous experiences, and there's lots of different ways of getting in contact with me. Of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any different podcast sharing program or platform, particularly on iTunes. Subscribing means you get access to all 115 plus episodes of the podcast, and also means that it's a great way for you to show that you are supporting the show by leaving a rating and a review, and maybe mentioning which your favourite guests. I really do appreciate it when people leave a rating and review, because it does help me grow the podcast and get it out to more people. Guys, like I said, I've got more episodes coming soon, some fantastic guests, and I really look forward to hearing your impressions of this and many more episodes of the podcast. But until then, bye.